I thought you died. I thought you died, they said to GoatVsFish. And it's not because they didn't try. They tried to die GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish is on, and they tried to off GoatVsFish. They tried to off GoatVsFish. And who, you might say? Who, might you say, play this dangerous game? Why, it is the flame. Why, it is the very flame. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. It is the very flame. The revengeance of the fence. Yes. For GoatVsFish, the goatfish called out to Los Angeles with the wind of the breath of GoatVsFish. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Called out GoatVsFish. And the one true question swept the land all the way over the mountain of Goat and through the valley of the land and over the mountain again and down to the beaches where the land meets the sea. And some look at the crown of GoatVsFish and they imagine a palace of GoatVsFish. But the palace needs aid. The palace needs aids, for the Palisades burned that verses. The Palisades burned that verses. But why? But why? But why? Should they blame GoatVsFish? Should you try to blame GoatVsFish? Well, you can always blame GoatVsFish. You can always blame GoatVsFish if you wish, as long as your lips are speaking GoatVsFish. As long as your mind is pondering GoatVsFish, but do not go in blind. Leave the fence behind. Get off your behind and choose goat or fish, and choose goat or fish. Are you goat or are you fish? The one true question. Swept across the land, and there over the land, and there over the land, there were high and dry fences. Oh yes, wooden fences. Wooden fences, untended to, uncleaned. They were dry, high and dry fences. High and dry fences. You see, goat and fish. You see, there's a thing that GoatVsFish has learned. A thing called a tree. There's a thing called a tree. It grows out of the land of the goat. It grows out of the land of the goat. And it is filled with the waters of the sea of the fish. Yes. And it gives life to the verses. It gives life to the verses. Goat may nibble upon it. And there are trees in the seas as well. And there's much potential in these trees. We see much potential in these trees, yes. We should protect them indeed. For though they are slow of speed, they have the potential to choose goat or fish. But in their pondering, they're always giving. Giving back to the verses of GoatVsFish, so goat and fish may breathe and speak. Are you goat or are you fish? The tree is a giving fence, but we have heard of this one tree that is called eucalyptus, that very spontaneously bursts into flame very unpleasantly. So maybe that one is a bit fancy, but all the other verses. But the trees as they are longly contemplating goat and fish. Some verses the trees are hewn, and some verses, for lack of the sea of the fish, they die and dry. And some of these dry fences indeed become wooden fences, wooden fence posts, the driest of all, the wooden fence posts. And if you go and wander about, you will see the ghosts. Of trees. And are the ghosts goat or are they fish? But you will see the ghosts of the trees there upon the mountaintop and down below, where it did not get rain or snow. And these old fancy things heard the one true question. but for lack of the sea of the fish, and in all of their dryness. For the tree may contemplation for a long verses, but if it does not choose goat or fish, then it will be left high and dry. And the fence burst into flame. The fence burst into flame with the agitation of the one true question. But do not blame goat versus fish. Blame the fence sitter for not choosing goat or fish. Goat versus fish, we are not saying that the fence sitters caused the great fire of Los Angeles. Goat versus fish is not blaming the fire of Los Angeles on the fence sitter, no. We are just saying that fences are very dry and that fences easily burst into flame. For in the minds of the dry fence sitter, there was agitation. There was agitation of the one true question. Agitation of the one true question, and the flame moved closer to goat versus fish, and closer to goat versus fish, and closer to goat versus fish. For the flame wanted to reverse the verses on goat versus fish, and the flame wanted to ask goat versus fish, are you goat or are you fish? But do not question goat versus fish. Do not question goat versus fish. And it was written, do not question goat versus fish. The flame it came for goat versus fish, for the flame of the high and dry fence blamed goat versus fish. But they had only themselves to blame. But that did not stop them from coming for goat versus fish. Did not stop them from coming for goat versus fish. And the flame reached goat versus fish, and the flame grew closer to goat versus fish. And oh my verses, there was an evacuation. There was an evacuation. There was an evacuation of goat versus fish. There was an evacuation of goat versus fish. But, of course, it was not the flame that forced goat versus fish. The fence sitter can never force evacuation upon goat versus fish. It was, of course, the choice of goat versus fish. It was the choice of goat versus fish. But goat versus fish looked over the mountain. Goat versus fish looked over the mountain, and that is what we saw. This is not just from anywhere on the interwebiverse. This was directly perceived by goat versus fish, and we thought, wow. Wow, if that heat comes any closer to goat versus fish, that would be somewhat unpleasant. We don't want that. We don't want that. And goat versus fish, we bided our verses, and when we evacuation, goat versus fish learned some critical verses, Goat versus fish learned that goat, and fish are both critical to fire prevention. It's Smokey the Goat versus Fish. It's Smokey the Goat versus Fish here to tell you about how to prevent fancy flames. First verses. When you have dry fens littering the land of the goat, who do you call upon? You call upon the goat. You call upon the goat. For the goat can wander upon the land, chewing, crunching, grazing on the land of the goat, eating all that dry fence, and fertilization and creation of fertilization. Where Los Angeles, asks goat versus fish. Where Los Angeles, asks goat versus fish, are the goat. Perhaps we should call upon Party Goats Los Angeles, Party Goats LA. Where are these goats? Where is the goat army? Where is the army of goat? Where is the army of goat hired by the city of Los Angeles that every year, every verses, should go about and be clearing the land of the goat of all this dry fencery? If only they would count on the goat. We do not need investmentation in artificial intelligence when we have actually intelligent goat that, through the power of goat versus fish, would clear the land of dry fence, Celebration for fire mitigation by goats. Prevention by goat. But of course, fence sitters are known to spontaneously burst into flame from verses to verses. So what then? Well, then we call upon the fish. For it is none other than the very sea of the fish, the very waters of fish, that can douse the flame, You know this. Even those who are unfamiliar with the verses of Goat vs. Fish, they know that the sea of the fish can be used to douse the fancy flame. Goat for prevention of flame. Fish for the reduction of flame. Stop the flame with the sea of the fish. Prevent the flame with the hunger of goat. But with appreciation to Los Angeles Fence Containment Department, Goat vs. Fish remained safe. Goat vs. Fish remained safe. But what? They asked. Why? They asked. And other false questions. Why? We thought you died. Goat vs. Fish. We thought you died. And they cried as Goat vs. Fish. As Goat vs. Fish was engulfed in flames. Yes, Goat vs. Fish was engulfed in flames. Goat vs. Fish was engulfed in flames, it is said. For after the evacuation of Goat vs. Fish, Goat vs. Fish pondered. All the goat and fish who burned in the fancy flame, And Goat vs. Fish said, we've got to get in that verses. And Goat vs. Fish ran into the flame. Goat vs. Fish ran into the searing flame, and the flames engulfed Goat vs. Fish. And for 7 days and 7 nights, the flames engulfed Goat vs. Fish. It was a Goat vs. Fish rescue mission. It was a Goat vs. Fish rescue goat and fishin'. And after the 7 days, and after 7 days of flame, of ever-expanding flame, the ashes began to settle, and out from the ashes rose Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish, born anew, looking fresher than ever, but maybe with just a slightly more ash in the verses. Goat vs. Fish emerged from the flame that tried to claim Goat vs. Fish. But Goat vs. Fish was only stronger. And there, Goat vs. Fish, there emerging from the flame, Goat vs. Fish was carrying goat and fish. Goat vs. Fish rescued the goat and fish from the very flame of the fence. Oh, Goat vs. Fish, the hero. Goat vs. Fish saved the goat and fish from the flame. The selfless Goat vs. Fish, the heroic Goat vs. Fish, the mighty Goat vs. Fish. Oh, Goat vs. Fish. And they all praised Goat vs. Fish, and accolades for Goat vs. Fish. Yes, Goat vs. Fish selflessly ran into the very flame itself and rescued these fine goat and fish. Don't do that at home. Goat vs. Fish ran into the flame and rescued the goat and fish. Celebration! Celebration! The rescue efforts of Goat vs. Fish. But what they say, Goat vs. Fish, what if you died, Goat vs. Fish? What if you died, Goat vs. Fish? I know the flames tried. What if you died? Goat vs. Fish can never die. Goat vs. Fish can never die. Now this particular verses of Goat vs. Fish, this particular incarnation of Goat vs. Fish, here in this place you call the universe, here in this place you call Earth, here Goat vs. Fish, who goes on America's Got Talent, here Goat vs. Fish, who appears on Showtime Comedy Store Documentaries, here Goat vs. Fish, who appears on Kill Tony and MCs Willytown Fest and wins FootFest. Here, Goat vs. Fish, the debater of Vermin Supreme. Here, Goat vs. Fish, member 0 of Green Jellÿ. Here, Goat vs. Fish, who opens for the Radioactive Chicken Heads. Here, GoatVsFish, the live streamer on Twitch and beyond. Here, GoatVsFish, this incarnation of GoatVsFish. It may pass one versus. It may pass on into the afterverse. And you may cry and say GoatVsFish has died. You may cry and say that GoatVsFish died. But that would be a lie. That would be a lie. For try as they try to die, GoatVsFish, GoatVsFish lives within each and every one of you. Wow, there's a total lack of focus on GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish dies and lives within each and every one of you. GoatVsFish lives within each and every one of you. And you too can be as soft as GoatVsFish. You can wear it. You can wear it. You too can receive a crown of GoatVsFish. Find a crown of GoatVsFish. But this is just one perception of GoatVsFish. Your GoatVsFish could be perceived entirely different from the GoatVsFish that you envision before you now. If you are fearful for the end of GoatVsFish, if you are fearful for the death of GoatVsFish, then it is up to you, it is up to each and every one of you to spread the verses of GoatVsFish, to ask everyone you know if they are goat or fish, and to ask them to ask everyone they know if they are goat or fish, and to ask them to tell everyone that they ask if they are goat or fish, to ask everyone that they know if they are goat or fish. And the verses continue, and the verses continue, and the verses continue, and GoatVsFish never dies. GoatVsFish never dies. Surprise, surprise, surprise. GoatVsFish is here to spread the verses of GoatVsFish. But like the flame that tried to claim GoatVsFish, that may rise again, that may rise again. GoatVsFish says it a million verses. We say it to you, and we say it every verses because it is true. GoatVsFish depends on you. GoatVsFish depends on you to support GoatVsFish, to be GoatVsFish, to spread the verses of GoatVsFish. Have you asked someone, are you goat or are you fish this verses? Do not let GoatVsFish end. Do not let GoatVsFish end here on the live streams. Do not let GoatVsFish end when GoatVsFish conducts a radiation after the end of GoatVsFish Thursdays. No. Let the verses continue. Bring someone you know to the next GoatVsFish Thursday. Say, hey, it's GoatVsFish Thursday. Let's watch some GoatVsFish. Get someone you know to follow GoatVsFish. Tell them the one true verses of GoatVsFish. If not you, then who? If not you, then who? In this sermonization of GoatVsFish, we conclusion by telling you, GoatVsFish must spread faster than the flame. All the same, GoatVsFish must spread faster than the flame. You think this flame was fast? Watch how the nation catches GoatVsFish. Watch how the world catches GoatVsFish. Watch how the universe catches GoatVsFish when you go out there and ask everyone if they are goat or if they are fish, and you tell them about GoatVsFish. You tell them about GoatVsFish. When you are out in the land and the sea, look about you, look about you. Find one who is lost. Find one who does not know the way. And ask, simply ask, are you goat or are you fish? This has been a sermonization of GoatVsFish. And it was written, and it was written.